Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for joining. We have an amazing group of registrants for this event from all corners of the world, and it's really gratifying to see the interest and the enthusiasm for this very important topic. I'm Patrick Heller. I'm the Chief Program Officer of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation about national oil companies, their present and their future. We talk sometimes about NOCs as the hidden half of the global oil and gas industry and the hidden half of the climate crisis. And one of the things that we have seen over and over again, not just in our research, but in the conversations that we're having with leaders of these companies, with governments, with activists and researchers all over the world, that there traditionally hasn't been as much attention as is necessary on the role that NOCs are playing as drivers of their economies and as key players in the energy transition, both nationally and globally across the world. And so what we're here to do today is to share some results of some new research that we've done at NRGI, but also to hear perspectives from panelists who are right in the middle of very active conversations about the future of these companies and what it means for sustainable development and for energy transition. I'm going to just kick us off a little bit with in framing the conversation to say that this work is work that builds on research that we've done in NRGI over the years, but also from a growing community of practice and knowledge, which is thinking quite heavily around NOCs and the roles that they're playing. Just in the last few weeks, we have several great new papers by partner organizations and a lot of thinking that's happening. The Production Gap Report touches on the roles of national oil companies. New work by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the World Benchmarking Alliance, the International Energy Agency, all look at how governments are financing the oil and gas sector, but also what they're doing and what NOCs are doing or are not doing, as the case may be, to help accelerate transition. There's a huge amount of work going on by other organizations leading this work at a regional level, organizations such as the African Center for Energy Policy, which is thinking about what a net transition or what a just transition means for Africa and the role of all of these public institutions in it, as well as work being done by think tanks that are focused on specific countries and what their NOCs are doing and the path they face forward. So I'm excited that there's more attention and more thinking that's being devoted to this topic. But one of the things that we've seen in this research, which we'll be sharing today, is there's still not nearly enough attention, focus, thinking, brainstorming on how NOCs transition, what are the consequences if they don't, and what that means for the citizens of the countries in which these companies play such a massively important role. So without more from me, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We're going to start today with a presentation of the new research, and that's going to be led by my colleagues Andrea Furnaro and David Manley of NRGI, who led and drove the two pieces of research that we'll be focusing on that we launched yesterday, and we'll put the link in the chat. And those two pieces are Facing the Future, What National Oil Companies Say About the Energy Transition, which is a survey of the statements of 21 NOCs worldwide, and Riskier Bet, Smaller Pockets, How NOCs Are Spending Public Revenues Amidst the Energy Transition. So David and Andrea are going to share the key findings, and then we're going to open it up for a discussion. And we're really grateful to have two fantastic panelists with us today. I'm going to introduce them briefly now. I won't be able to do justice to all of the accolades that they've built over their careers, but just so that you know who they are, we have Dr. Kwame Banyuako, who is the General Manager for Strategy and Investment at the Ghana National Petroleum Corporation. And Dr. Banyuako is right in the middle of some of these conversations in real time, thinking about GNPC and its role and how it adapts both its work around its core traditional oil and gas business, and also thinking about new investments or new directions for the company in the future. Then we'll have Ana Lilia Moreno, who's the coordinator of the Competition and Regulatory Affairs program at the think tank Mexico Evalúa, which is one of the leading think tanks in Mexico. working on economic justice and energy transition. Ana is a leading thinker, researcher, analyst on how Mexico tackles transition both to its energy systems and its economy, including the role of Pemex, Mexico's giant national oil company. Couple of ground rules. What I would say is, please post questions using the Q&A function. And I've asked our panelists, if they can, if there's a question that comes to them, to respond in real time as we go using that Q&A box. We'll also hopefully have some time at the end for open discussion among the panelists. This event is being recorded. We will post it on NRGI's YouTube page and on our social media. So please, if you find the conversation today interesting, tell people about it, and we will we'll make sure that it's available for people to see. So with that, I'm going to turn it first to you, Andrea, to kick us off presenting the research. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I will share some key findings from one of the two reports we are presenting today, which we named Facing the Future, what national oil companies say about the energy transition. And in this report, we analyzed public statements from 21 national oil companies around the world related to the energy transition, and especially to the concept of transition risk. And we examined what strategies, if any, these national oil companies are making public to address this risk. We built our approach using a very similar concept of transition risk as the one used in the financial sector and by many climate organizations, although our focus lies on those aspects of transition risk that are particularly relevant for national oil companies, especially the potential decline in demand and prices for oil and gas. And our objective was to understand whether these 21 companies that you can see here are acknowledging, assessing, and actively trying to mitigate transition risk. Next slide, please. And our findings show that only 9 out of the 21 NOCs mentioned that the energy transition could impact their business. So that means less than half of the companies that we studied. And the manner and depth of this acknowledgement differ among this NOC. As you can see here in these examples, Pertamina, the NOC from Indonesia, made a very compelling statement saying that failure to respond promptly to transition risk could result in a potential loss of around 50% of its revenue by 2030. And these stand out as one of the strongest statements that we found. I have also included here the example of Pemex, because for the first time in its latest business plan, Pemex briefly acknowledges the energy transition as a potential risk. This despite both Pertamina and Pemex less favorable performance in other dimensions of our analysis. And another important finding is that an even smaller number of NOCs acknowledge, in particular, the domestic energy transition as risk. Only 5 of the NOCs we analyzed. And this lack of acknowledgement of the domestic transition as a potential risk is particularly notable among the Asian NOCs in our sample. Next slide, please. In relation to the second dimension of our analysis, our findings show that only 4 NOCs have mentioned that they have conducted some form of transition risk assessment. These NOCs are Ecopetrol from Colombia, Petrobras from Brazil, PTT from Thailand, and Pertamina. And the extent of disclosure of, for example, methodological details, assumptions, and results vary among these NOCs. The brief examples I'm showing here are from Ecopetrol and Petrobras, which are the companies providing more details in this regard. For example, Ecopetrol's latest publication mentioned the use of energy transition scenarios, assumptions in its shadow price of carbon. However, future oil price assumptions used in scenario analysis are not made public by the company. And on the other hand, Petrobras has published more detailed information regarding oil price assumptions. This includes, for example, a base scenario that, according to the company, is in line with the announced pledges scenarios from the International Energy Agency. Next slide, please. In the third and last dimension, we look at statements suggesting the implementation of some sort of mitigation plan. And our findings show that only 5 of these NOCs mention strategies in this regard. And again, it's important to note the varying levels of details in these public statements. I'm highlighting here 2 examples from YPF from Argentina and Sonangol from Angola for a couple of reasons. First, because they have not mentioned the use of risk assessment tools, although of course we don't know if they may be using these tools privately. Nevertheless, both NOCs briefly mentioned taking action to mitigate this risk. And second, because both companies assume that increased investment in low carbon energies without necessarily reducing investment in risky oil and gas projects represent a viable mitigation strategy. And while we don't really explore in depth this in the report, I think this type of claims raises important questions for future debates and analysis regarding the extent, for example, to which renewable energies investment can truly hedge NOCs from risky oil and gas investments. And on the other hand, Petrobras and Ecopetrol stand out by providing more detailed statements on how they intend to use transition risk assessment to protect their investments. However, even in these cases, the question of defining how robust the assumptions used are and whether the companies are effectively incorporating this analysis into, for example, sensitivity analysis for investment decisions remain open. Next slide, please. We also analyze different types of business strategies and projects that NOCs are mentioning in their publications, as we believe this can affect somehow their exposure to transition risk. And a key observation that I would like to share today is that almost all the NOCs we analyzed emphasize increasing investment in oil and gas. We couldn't find examples of intentional declines in oil and gas investment. Petrobras, Petronas, and Sonangol mentioned some plans to divest from less valuable assets, but not necessarily to mitigate transition risk or downsize their oil and gas operation. And also, most of these NOCs intend to diversify into gas, oil refineries, and petrochemicals. This analysis also reaffirms the fact already shown by different recent reports from other organizations that some NOCs are investing in large-scale clean energy projects without signaling a clear diversification strategy. And moreover, in terms of explicit intentions to reduce Scope 1 and 2 emissions, very few NOCs that we studied express plans in this regard. And finally, I find interesting the case of some NOCs that are mentioning and highlighting in some cases large-scale investments beyond the conventional oil and gas sector, such as YPF's plan to participate in lithium extraction from salt flats in Argentina, Sonatrach in lithium and phosphate production in Algeria, Pertamina's involvement in the Indonesia Battery Corporation, and PTT making investment in the health industry in Thailand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. So hello, everyone. My name is David, one of the other authors of the report. So Facing the Future looks at what oil companies are saying. And our next report, Riskier Bets, Smaller Pockets, looks at what we think NOCs are doing or will be doing, specifically in upstream investments. And the big issue we're looking at is transition risk. And one nice way of looking at transition risk is that we know that oil demand is probably close to the peak. It's been rising for many decades, but more and more analysts believe it's close to the peak. But the risk, the uncertainty, is that we don't know what happens after the peak. We don't know if we're at the peak of Table Mountain, with many decades of a sustained plateau of demand, or at the peak of the Matterhorn, with a very sharp fall in demand as we go down the slope. And if you've ever climbed a mountain, particularly these two, both are very shrouded in clouds. And so it's difficult to know where you're going at the peak, what the slope is on the other side. And it's very dangerous to know as you step forward whether you're going to be on solid ground or whether you're in thin air and you're going to drop. And that is the risk that national companies are facing. And so it's both useful for climate policy, but also for fiscal policy of these countries to understand this risk. So both Facing the Future and indeed many other analysts, include the IEA, suggest that NOCs and much of the oil industry is aligning their investments with a sort of Table Mountain scenario. And in terms of the IEA, that's their STEP scenario, which is kind of the status quo. It's what's going to happen if there's no further advancements in climate policy. However, although it's not certain, there's increasing evidence of a more Matterhorn scenario, such as the IEA's net zero emissions scenario or the announced pledges scenario. And in our report, we detail analysis that show the quickening pace of the energy transition, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So our question is, what happens if national companies are investing according to the Table Mountain, that they're assuming that oil demand will probably continue, but what reality might be like is the Matterhorn. And there's many different ways of looking at this. That one of the main impacts will definitely be on government revenues, and other organizations like Carbon Tracker will be coming out with reports on this. But we look specifically at investment, but for two reasons. One, it's very important for fiscal stewardship, because this is billions of dollars of public money that could be used to generate revenues in oil, or could be used somewhere else in the economy to diversify that economy. And it also speaks to a dichotomy of control. This is what governments and NOCs can actually control in terms of facing this risk. There are escape plans for NOCs. As we've seen, some NOCs are looking to pivot towards gas. They want to decarbonize. Some are looking to regional or domestic markets. Maybe some can generate hydrogen or produce petrochemicals. So these are all ways out, but as we detail in the report, we don't think they're full escape plan. They're not foolproof. So let's get into some of the results. So we took all of the capital expenditure, the investment of NOCs across the world that are projected over the next 10 years. And we did this 2 years ago in our Riskier Bet report, and we've done this again now. And we separated them in terms of how much of this investment breaks even under each of the IEA scenarios. So the net zero emissions scenario, the announced pledges scenario, the stated policies scenario, and any investments that don't even break even under those scenarios, but break even under something much higher than that. So the more orange and red the scenario, the riskier it is for NOCs. And what we see here is that about $1.8 trillion worth of NOC money is going into upstream investment over the next 10 years. And a growing proportion of that is growing into higher risk investments with higher costs. And in fact, that proportion has doubled over the last 2 years, from about 200 billion to 425 billion. In the report, we detail specifically each NOC, how they match up with that riskiness. And it's a bit of a myth that all NOCs will be the last one standing. In fact, there'll only be one last one standing. The Middle Eastern NOCs from Iran, Turkmenistan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and so on, as everyone knows, they have very low costs, and most of their investments going forward are going to be relatively safe, even under a net zero scenario. However, that's not the case for a lot of other NOCs. And as Andrea said, Pertamina is particularly afraid because they are right at the top of this chart here. Much of their investments going forward are particularly high risk. Kwame will be pleased to know that GNPC doesn't actually feature on this table because they're actually, at the moment, relatively safe. And thankfully, because they avoided some recent investments, they're continuing to be safe. We also show that much of the investments actually concentrated in just about 4 countries, in China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Norway. And these are contributing over half of all the capex in the next 10 years. The Chinese NOCs and other Asia-Pacific NOCs, Equinor and NOC from Iran, have all been increasing their investments pipelines since 2021, since our last report. While Russia, Brazil, Oman, and Mexico NOCs have all been reducing their investment pipelines. So there's been some shifts increasing and some shifts down decreasing. We also found that investment in total across the industry, both the national companies and the rest of the industry, has been declining since 2014, since the last oil boom, but hasn't increased very much since prices rose recently. But there's 2 things to note here. One is that even though investment has fallen, this investment is still in line with a step scenario, so a sense that oil demand will continue, rather than a much faster transition scenario such as APS or net zero. So investment hasn't fallen enough to be in line with these faster transition scenarios. The other thing to recognize is that the rest of the industry investment has fallen much faster than national companies. So over the last decade, national companies have now become a much more important segment of the whole industry. And so that's why it's even more important now to focus on this segment, to understand fossil fuel supply and fossil fuel policies. So this report has 2 parts. One is riskier bets, and we just saw that many NOCs are making riskier bets. They're increasing their amount of investment in high-cost assets. But both the NOCs and their government backers have now smaller financial pockets. So they have less means to afford those bets if they go wrong. And in the report, we detail a few different aspects of this. And here we show 2 of them. One is the increasing indebtedness of NOCs themselves, particularly the case in Latin America, and even without the effect of Pemex, the most indebted NOC in the world, but also in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Middle East and North Africa, have all been increasing their debts significantly. But governments have also been increasing their debt across the board, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in Latin America, Caribbean, and sub-Saharan Africa. So this means that going forward, as the energy transition continues, as NOCs are making riskier bets, if these bets don't turn out to be generating enough profits, this could spell quite significant financial problems, both the NOCs, but then bring the governments into that financial crisis. And so this becomes an issue, a much broader economic and financial issue that many more people need to worry about. So as a summary, what we're looking at here is transition risk, which is basically, we don't know if the future is much like Table Mountain or the Matterhorn. And we looked at how NOCs are facing this future. Only 9 out of 21 NOCs are acknowledging the risk of the energy transition. Only 4 have shown they're assessing this risk. Most still plan to expand oil and gas upstream investment. Some plan to decarbonize and invest in clean energy. But how much does this actually mitigate transition risk? We also saw that NOCs are making riskier bets. They're on course to invest $1.8 trillion over the next 10 years, more than 2 years ago. And double the amount is going to projects that don't break even under announced pledges scenario. And some particularly large NOCs are highly exposed. NOCs like Pertamina, NNPC, Ecopetrol, and Petronas. But at the same time, the NOCs and their governments have smaller pockets. The riskier bets of some NOCs are large, and they're large opportunities for costs for their governments. This is billions of dollars of public money that could be going somewhere else. And so it's very important to understand what these decisions are and are they being made in the best interest of people. And both NOC and government finances are deteriorating, so there's less ability to afford these bad bets. So that's all. I'll hand back to Patrick.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrea and David, for those presentations. And again, I'd encourage anyone who has questions about the presentations or the research to please post those in the Q&A, and Andrea and David can respond as we go, and they'll be back on the mic in a little while as well. Now I'm going to open it up a little bit to our two panelists, and I'm very interested to hear your perspectives based on the experiences of the countries where you're working and you're focusing, but also your broader perspectives on the sector globally. And Dr. Banyuako, we'll start with you. The question that I'm going to put to both you and Anna in this round is a simple one. How do you think NOCs will look different 10 years from now than they do today? What is the future? What does the future have in store for these companies? Kwame, over to you first.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And as usual, let me take the opportunity to thank NRGI for these two reports. Most of the time, we fail to admit that these reports are utilized within even the commercial entities to help support our strategy planning and others. So maybe we don't acknowledge that much enough. So thank you guys for the work you're doing. Of course, there are issues that we'll get into, but in terms of NOCs recognizing that the energy transition risk is real, I doubt whether there's any NOC which says that the risk is not real. It's just that you focus on using publicly available information to do your analysis. For instance, I hold in my hand this, basically, Patrick, maybe you've never seen this, but that is the 2021-2030 corporate plan for GNPC. And on page 48 of that document, it focuses on energy transition implications and planning. So whilst it might not be publicly available, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And so in this document, GNPC recognizes, for the records, that there's a pathway to carbon neutrality, even if you're going to continue with oil. There are implications for oil and gas companies. These are the headings within the document. I thought I'll share with you, just to let us all agree that whilst you might not have had all the documents required, I'm not questioning the methodology, because basically you are clear with the method you use. You are using publicly available documents. So if GNPC's document is not easily available to you, you cannot comment on that. But that also does not suggest that the organization doesn't have any plan. So I felt I'll make it clear. And having said that, it also means that these plans are thinking about the future. So GNPC is looking at what happens 10 years, just like your question will suggest. We are looking at the transitional planning. What happens? Are we focusing on oil and gas and making sure that we reach carbon neutrality with oil and gas? Or we also looking at expanding the scope in terms of the sources of energy? And that I can confirm, this document suggests that GNPC is looking at all that. So in terms of the recognition that the energy transition risk is real, GNPC, for instance, has enough information to suggest that it's planning towards the transition. However, we can go into the critical issues of what our thinking, our assumptions around STEP, or whether we are doing NZ or whatever, net zero or these things. We can have a debate around the assumptions underlying it. What I see in the two papers, and I had a chance to look at embargoed versions of the two papers. So I've done quite a bit of reading in that. It looks like the focus is always on the demand side, and nobody talks about the supply side. So yes, I understand the fact that if net zero is the pathway that eventually happens, there is an effect on the demand side. But then what happens to the supply side as well? And if we cannot guarantee that supply will decline faster than demand, or demand will decline faster than supply, then our predictions around pricing then becomes a bit fuzzy. Because yes, we look at IEA. IEA does make predictions over time. If we are all stuck with IEA's predictions of what the price of oil will be post-COVID, the figures they were talking about was $40, that the price of oil will never go above $40 in the next so many years, because they could not even envisage issues like Russia, Ukraine, isn't it? So whatever modeling they do has certain assumptions. And when these assumptions change, it obviously makes, so it is easy for us all to rely on IEA. But in our internal models, we also recognize that some of the IEA modeling over time has not always materialized. And so we also have internal models. At the time that IEA was predicting $40 per barrel for oil for 2023, 2024, 2025, GNPC, in our internal documents, we were looking at $65. If we look at the current figures in terms of the pricing of oil, between GNPC and IEA, who is closer to the market price? So we understand the fact that IEA does a more global analysis, but we also need to look at our own peculiar circumstances and have models that really more or less fits our circumstances. And of course, we have economists on both sides. So economists from IEA, we also have economists in GNPC. Everybody is struggling to predict what will happen to demand. We also need to look at the supply side. And I think David and Andrea did a good job trying to give us a sense of what will happen. But we also have a sense of what we think the pricing will be over time. And so it is not that we are basically deviating from IEA, but we are looking at our own historical data as well, what we think. I attend meetings of the African Petroleum Producers Organization. I have an idea of what they think will happen and what they think should be the solutions in terms of a regional market for oil and gas. What happens if Africa is able to pool its resources, which currently, and I'll give you figures, Africa has $85 billion in sovereign wealth funds sitting outside the continent of Africa. That's bigger than the total asset base of NNPC, GNPC, and anybody else. What happens if Africa decides that, for instance, we want to pull together, we'll create regional demand for our oil because we don't believe that the energy transition is really about the environment, but it's about who controls the energy sources of the future. We need to get into the mindsets of people to see what they are thinking about, whether they think the transition is about the environment or is even about control of the future sources of energy. Then we look at what their reactions are. They are thinking about regional markets for oil and gas because they are not going to allow the resources to be stranded. In that case, what happens to supply? When these bold steps are made by regional bodies, what happens to demand for oil and gas? So it is not just, we can't just take, always just a global view, say that there'll be a plateau. For instance, peak demand is not necessarily decline in demand, like David said. We don't know how long the plateau, for instance, will take place. I don't think ExxonMobil or Chevron has read the script because they keep buying new assets in oil and gas. So I'm not too sure about whether, like David says, we are near peak demand, or even what happens, even when we get to peak demand, what happens to supply? If supply is falling faster than the fall in demand, prices will be high. and those who still stay in the market will be making the return. So I thought I'll just end here to allow others to come in. These are my initial thoughts.
Thanks very much, Kwame, and a very rich set of statements and reflections. And one of the things that I really pick up on in what you shared that I think links to the analysis and the steps going forward is the concept of significant uncertainty about what the future will look like, and how NOCs and their governments are making decisions today, managing and navigating risks amidst that uncertainty about the future. I'm going to come back to you on that because I want to hear more about what GNPC's risk mitigation strategies are amidst this uncertainty that you point to. But I want to come to you now, Anna, and I'll really with the same question, which is, what do you think NOCs will look different? How will they look different? Will they look different 10 years than they do today? Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you for this opportunity of sharing with you these insights, and congratulations about the very deep research that Andrea and David performed. It's outstanding. I think that having a good perspective of how companies are performing their assessment of risks and how they foresee the future is quite relevant for having a good perspective on the most important risks. And regarding your question, I would like to remark this part of the report that goes on, addresses the assessment on transition risks, on the needs to make challenging scenarios, and having very granular analysis for the companies. That is crucial, because as long as companies have an investment plan based on real scenarios and disclose information and incorporate the stakeholders in their decisions, and that implies civil society, academy, private companies. I think that the futures can be seen as a challenging governance scheme. The companies have to realize that the future needs the consensus of society because of the uncertainty that implies the fact that we don't know the speed at which demand and supply will change. So I think that the diversification of energy portfolios and the public spending on infrastructure investments and new focus on sustainable projects implies obviously the decisions that rely on the net present value of the projects. And I think that that is a very remarkable observation that the researchers made when they scouted the all companies' statements. And some of them remark these points, that the energy transition needs to be profitable and needs to control risks, as long as the governments need to consider the opportunity costs of diversification. And I liked very much the analysis the researchers made on Ecopetrol from Colombia, because it's very positive to see a very young company, a state-owned company, that is putting on the table of the civil society, because of the performance of its transparency and accountability standards, the decisions that it is making. And I think that that is very remarkable, because Ecopetrol is not Equinor, is not a very big company compared to the biggest ones in the world, But as long as we read in the report, Ecopetrol is putting good milestones regarding these bets. So I would like to recognize that because companies in the future will need to address more transparency and more convergence. And I would like to remark the fact that regulators need to incorporate more on these discussions because I can see in the future a lot of convergence with other sectors like telecommunications, for example. The future is also related to the digital transformation in the energy sector, and the incorporation of the Internet of Things requires a lot of energy and a lot of investment and a lot of smart regulations. So that is the way I see the future. I can see opportunities and obviously the important risk related to the volatility of the markets and the uncertainty of the prices. But I think that as long as the companies incorporate good governance schemes in the decision making, the future can be more controlled or at least a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and really valuable in particular to weave together what you did in terms of the governance and the political side of this as well. That it's about NOC's own strategic planning, but also, as you say, and I think your comments really draw it out in a really important way, how these companies are engaging with their stakeholders, and that means their government stakeholders and also their public stakeholders in this moment as well. Thank you. Kwame, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to come back to this question about risk. So, you spoke in a lot of detail around these uncertainties that the whole global oil market and national companies in particular are facing. How do you think about, or how should we be thinking about what a risk mitigation strategy within an NOC should look like in this moment?
Thanks. And I think the NOCs do recognize these risks. The risk to demand, the demand side, risk to finance sources of finance for investment, regulatory risk as well. The fact that there are regulations that are changing, which the NOC in, let's say, Ghana has no control over. What EU does with its regulations, which affects which cars are produced, the sources of energies these cars are used. GNPC has no control. The government of Ghana has no control. So these are risks that are real, and that we need to look at how we deal with them. Of course, as David and Andrea mentioned in the both reports, some of these conversations are around energy transition risk started from the financial sector. The finance institutions, pressure was prevailed upon on them to ensure that whichever projects that they finance takes the environment, some consideration of its consequence on the environment into consideration. And then the environmental lobby group also took advantage of that and then pushed forward towards reduction or even move away from fossil fuel. So these risks are real. We see it whenever we've gone to the market looking for funding. It is real. And so I think the NOCs are in no illusions about the fact that these risks are there. Mitigation in terms of people using the environmental consequences as an excuse, as people will say that NOCs will need to look at the technology that they use. Just 2 days ago, I read a paper which I hear will be submitted by IEA at COP28 about carbon capture, the fact that it might not be a long-term solution to the environment problem. So this is one other risk, the risk of shifting goalposts. Maybe if I can repeat that, the risk of shifting goalposts. where, let's say, all NOCs sign up to the Paris Agreement and the dictates of everything. In 5-6 years' time, a new goal, you're going to look for funding, and there's a new goalpost. New targets are then set. At the end of the day, how do you plan? So, I mean, there are so many risks that are not even captured, explicitly. It's one of the fears of, let's say, Apple member countries as to where what is the long-term play in itself. Because at one stage, gas was not even a transition fuel. Then there was an argument over, well, okay, then gas is accepted as a transition fuel. So this brings up a comment that somebody made at a conference recently. He asked whether 30 years ago, if we were defining what is green energy 30 years ago, whether oil would not have been defined as green energy, especially when it was the main fueling Western development. So we recognize these risks. They are very cataloged in the report, and like Anna said, very detailed report, try to look at all the risks that we need to take note of. But the issue really is around, are these the only risk? What is the risk to a poor country which is oil dependent today of stopping to produce oil and hoping to adopt green technologies that it doesn't have? So you are being asked to move away from what you have. What you have expertise over, you have gathered some few expertise over some few years in producing. All of a sudden, you are being asked to move away from that and go into a technology that you don't have the expertise in producing. And it looks like people assume that all of a sudden, if African NOCs decide to diversify into renewables, they will have the resources to invest in those renewables. They can only count on the oil and gas resources of today to even invest in the renewables. So even the move from oil and gas to renewables for a poor developing country with an NOC is also risky, because the technology is not there, the resources are not there. He probably doesn't have the human capacity to deal with that. He has developed some capacity in these old technologies. All of a sudden, a timeline is given, 2030, 2035, or something you need to move away from. Patrick, you've been to Ghana. Explain to all the people on the call how long you think it will be, Ghana will be able to produce enough electricity for electric cars. How long it will take Ghana to produce electricity from what? Solar, wind, or whatever, to support the electric cars that are being introduced, because it will require electricity. So all these are posing risk. Let's not make it look like it's only the oil and gas. When poor countries engage in oil and gas, that has risk. Moving into renewables and technologies that they don't know also has risk. And when the rest of the world promised even $100 million a year for transition money, not even a single dollar has happened. So assuming all of us at the time that this promise was made, decided that we are not going to make any further investments in oil and gas. So for instance, GNPC didn't buy shares in the Occidental thing, which has actually over a 2-year period generated $395 million for GNPC at a cost of $170 million. Assuming we took the decision that because of the energy transition, we are not buying that asset, we let it go, wouldn't we have made a risky bet? Is that also not a risky bet? Because now the money that we are making today, we would have lost because we followed everybody and thinking that stop investing in oil and gas and do renewable. But this would have been an opportunity, huge opportunity lost. So
thank you, Pamela. Yeah,
there are risky bets on both sides, and we need to analyze all of them.
I think one of the things, two things that I really pull out from what you've shared, and I think matter so much. One is, and this we're timed right before COP. And one of the things that has emerged repeatedly in the work that we're doing in this space is the exact point that you made, that supporting poor, low-income countries that are energy poor as well as low income requires resources, and that the promises that have been made have not materialized in any meaningful way, and that a conversation around what transition looks like has to include some serious commitments for what an equitable transition looks like as well. One reaction to build on what you said, one of the steps that we want to take moving forward too is, and the Facing the Future report is one element of this, is actually creating some experience sharing among NOCs in terms of how different companies are managing these multifaceted risks, and to generate and build that learning. This report is just a drop in the bucket, but we're really hoping that together many of us can build a community of practice. I want to come to Anna with one more question for you, and then Andrea and David, I'm going to turn it back to you for any reactions or final thoughts before we close. Anna, I want to turn to Pemex and Mexico in particular, given all of the thinking and work that you and your colleagues have been doing. Pemex is the most indebted NOC in the world, and as our research shows, it's one of the ones that is most exposed to the risks of the global energy transition. I'm interested in particular in your thinking about what civil society in Mexico and partners of Mexican civil society elsewhere can do to strategically kind of influence the next stages of the government's strategy vis-a-vis Pemex or Pemex's own strategy.
Well, that's a challenging question, and I love it because we have tried many strategies by now, and we're continue innovating on it. We consider that Mexico is a bit trapped in an energy paradox that is losing the opportunity to perform a full integration with North America. So civil society can act from a regional perspective regarding the challenges that Pemex is facing. And I would say that for the next administration, as we will be leaving elections, presidential and Congress elections next year, a good topic for pushing into the agenda is the interaction of civil society organizations from the three countries for looking at Pemex from a systematic perspective and not only as a state-owned company in Mexico. I looked with a lot of interest to David's presentation, and the graphs that you depicted, David, show some calculations with Pemex and without Pemex regarding the risks that Latin America faces in its oil and gas sectors. And that is very interesting because that demonstrates that the problems that Pemex is facing are connected with the entire region. And as long as we continue with our free trade agreement and the perspective of integrating from an energy sector in the fuels and the electricity sectors to North America, and with the possibilities to expanding this integration to Central America, then we could think out of the box for Pemex. And that is not only from the divesting perspective, but also from the diversification perspective, and also integrating other things from the visionary perspective. That is, I will repeat about Ecopetrol. I think that is a very good example of how to perform from the state-owned company an energy strategy for incorporating new projects and partnerships, because this administration has closed the business model of Pemex. It closed the opportunities for performing partnerships with the private sector, but also with the civil society. I again will repeat about the governance importance of incorporating a lot of points of view to the decision making within the company, starting with the union, because from when the constitutional reform was approved in 2013, in those times, the union was a very problematic stakeholder. So the legislators decided to take it out from the board. And I think that that was a very bad decision, because now, facing the energy transition challenges, we need to incorporate workers to the decision-making processes in order to incorporate justice in the strategy of energy transition, and from a regional perspective, demonstrate that workers can incorporate themselves to better positions and better opportunities for them and for their children, because Pemex and state-owned companies in Latin America are very tied to stakeholders like this type of unions that are transgenerational. The children and the grandchildren of the oil and gas workers, at least in Mexico, they inherit the positions within the company. So when we see this kind of resistance to the energy transition, we need to look at these kind of interests that are transgenerational. They want to preserve their positions and their salaries and the privileges that they have. But we know that the climate emergence will sooner or later destroy this value, because of the risk that the company is exposed, but because of the territory and the whole population is exposed to these climate risks. So as long as we raise awareness, and maybe that is another strategy that civil society can do, to promote awareness campaigns directed to the unions, so that there is a change of mind within the unions that can foster their incorporation to the decision making and the proposal building. From a regional perspective, I think that that's a challenge, but that's an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. No shortage of challenges, as you've shared, and also a lot of proactive ideas that are really valuable as people in Mexico, but more broadly carry this work forward. We're about to come to time. I want to give Andrea and David 30 seconds each, just to share any reactions or final thoughts. It's been a rich discussion both in the chat and through our panelists. So Andrea, to you first.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for the panelists for these super interesting and useful comments. I just want to emphasize one issue, that is the importance of NOCs actually disclosing their transition risk mitigation strategies. And I think maybe this is one of the reasons why we believe that it is still important to look at publicly available information, although these only give you one part of the story. And the idea here is in line with what you all have been saying, that I don't think that how NOCs handle transition risk should be just a concern for NOC managers, investors, even, for example, ESG rating agencies, and it has mostly been up to today, but rather should be at the center of the interest of citizens and civil society organizations in NOC countries. And I think that this type of analysis that we are presenting today, for which the disclosure of NOCs is extremely important, should be particularly relevant for these type of actors, and much more can be done to create better accountability and transparency practice around how NOCs are managing transition risk, and potentially some mechanism, for example, to ensure more direct engagement of citizens, which need to see themselves, I think, more and more as citizen shareholders of NOCs in assessing this risk, auditing company assessment, and ensuring that these assessments are being effectively used in promoting better mitigation strategy, and also, as Dr. Kwama was saying, taking advantage of the opportunities that the energy transition creates as well.
Thank you very much, Andrea. David.
Thank you both, Dr. Kwame and Ana Moreno, and to the questions. Your comments and questions all point to the fact that our research process works well, because the next set of research that's coming out directly relates to your questions and comments on regional markets in Africa, on Pemex, and financial debt issues in NOCs and governments. So stay tuned, and we're looking for collaboration and funding to keep that sort of research going. The second point relates to everything you've all said. We don't know what's on the other side of the mountain. Exxon doesn't, IEA doesn't, and NOC doesn't. I have no idea. But NOC is investing billions of dollars of public money. This could be used to generate more oil energy, but it could be used in many other ways. And so it's really important to understand how this money is being invested. And it requires many sets of eyes and thinking and analysis and oversight to understand this topic. So thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to all of our speakers and panelists, and thanks to all of you for joining from all over the world. The reports are posted. I've also just pasted in the link NRGI and many of our partner organizations, including several represented around our virtual table today, will be having conversations around NOCs in various spots at COP. And so for those of you who are either going or interested in following online, the link that I just posted, it's also available on our website, can help you see what's coming up. But more broadly speaking, and echoing what Andrea and David just said, this is an area that requires much deeper and more extensive thinking, brainstorming, collaboration across all of us. And so we'll look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you very much.